October 24th, 1944, 25,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, Commander David McCampbell scanned the horizon through the bulletproof windscreen of his F6F-5 Hellcat. The Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine hummed smoothly beneath him, its 2,000 horsepower thrumming through the airframe. His wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, held position 300 yards to starboard, just the two of them. 7 aircraft had launched from USS Essex minutes earlier, but McCampbell had already sent 5 pilots to intercept the Japanese bomber formation below. That left him and Rushing alone against what the ship's radar operators were calling a massive inbound strike. The radio crackled. Bandits, multiple formations, Angels 20 bearing 270. McCampbell's head turned west. What he saw made him key his microphone twice. Acknowledgment. Nothing more. Because there were no words for what filled the sky ahead, not 20 aircraft, not 30, 60, maybe more. A vast formation of Mitsubishi A6M0s and Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars, the elite fighter escorts protecting Japanese bombers racing toward Task Force 38.3. They flew in tight combat spread, layered from 18,000 to 25,000 feet. Sunlight glinted off canopies and polished cowlings. The enemy had numbers. They had position. They had the tactical advantage that doctrine said determined who lived and who died in aerial combat. McCampbell glanced at his fuel gauge, half full. He'd launched in a hurry when radar detected the inbound strike, and the ground crew hadn't finished refueling Minsi III. Maybe 90 minutes of combat time. Maybe less if he pushed the throttle to war emergency power. The flight manual, the tactical bulletins, every carrier fighter doctrine publication distributed since the Hellcat entered service in August 1943 said the same thing. 2 fighters do not engage 60. You maintain altitude advantage. You wait for reinforcements. You preserve your aircraft and pilot for the next engagement. The enemy bombers were the primary threat. His 5 squadron mates were already diving on that formation. 6 50 caliber Brownings per aircraft tearing into unescorted Judys and Vals. But these 60 fighters weren't going to let that happen unopposed. In minutes, they'd roll inverted and plunge down on McCampbell's outnumbered pilots. Then the bombers would reach the carriers. Essex, Lexington, Princeton, Langley. 12,000 sailors aboard those 4 flat tops, depending on combat air patrol to keep Japanese bombs from turning steel decks into infernos. Sometimes doctrine is more dangerous than the enemy. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. David McCampbell hadn't planned to become the Navy's most lethal fighter ace. He'd planned to be discharged, graduated from Annapolis in June 1933, 4th in his class, an expert rifleman and Eastern Intercollegiate diving champion. But the Great Depression had gutted military budgets. Congress passed legislation limiting new commissions. Half of McCampbell's graduating class received orders to report for duty. The other half, including McCampbell, received honorable discharges and handshakes. He spent a year working construction in Alabama, then as an assembly mechanic for Douglas Aircraft, watched from the factory floor as men who'd graduated below him flew fighters off carriers. Finally, in June 1934, the Navy recalled him, Ensign, U.S. Naval Reserve. He served 3 years aboard the heavy cruiser USS Portland before qualifying for flight school. In April 1938, he received his Wings of Gold at Pensacola. His first squadron assignment, fighting Squadron 4 aboard USS Ranger. He flew the stubby, barrel-shaped F4F Wildcat, an aircraft respected for its ruggedness, but outmatched in nearly every performance category by the Japanese Zero. In May 1940, McCampbell transferred to USS Wasp as landing signal officer. The LSO stood on the carrier's stern, guiding pilots to safe landings with colored paddles, critical duty, demanding split-second judgment and ice water calm. But it wasn't combat. September 15th, 1942, Wasp was operating near Guadalcanal when Japanese submarine I-19 fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 3 struck home. Massive explosions ignited aviation fuel. The fires spread beyond control. McCampbell survived the sinking, but the Wasp didn't. He returned stateside, promoted to lieutenant commander, assigned to Naval Air Station Melbourne, Florida, USO instructor, teaching other men how to bring fighters aboard carriers while the Pacific War raged without him. For a year, he watched the combat reports, the Wildcats' kill ratios against Zeros, the desperate tactical innovations pilots developed to survive against superior maneuverability. The Thach weave, named for Commander John S. Thach, who devised a defensive scissors maneuver at the Battle of Midway. 2 Wildcats flying abreast, turning into each other when Zeros attacked, creating crossing angles that trapped pursuers in defensive guns. It worked. Barely. The Wildcat survived through tactics and pilot courage, not performance. But by mid-1943, something had changed. Grumman delivered a new fighter to the fleet, the F6F Hellcat, everything the Wildcat should have been. The F6F-3 variant mounted the same Pratt and Whitney R2800 that powered the Corsair and the Army's P-47 Thunderbolt, 2,000 horsepower, driving a 13-foot, 4-bladed propeller. Maximum speed, 376 miles per hour at 23,400 feet. Service ceiling, 37,300 feet. 6 NM2 50-caliber machine guns, 400 rounds per gun, concentrated in the wings with 18 inches of convergence at 400 yards. Self-sealing fuel tanks, 212 pounds of cockpit armor, bulletproof windscreen. The Navy had finally produced a fighter that didn't just match the Zero. It exceeded it in almost every measurable category, except low-speed turn radius. And the Hellcat killed Zeros at ratios the Wildcat never approached. In August 1943, McCampbell got his chance. Orders to command Fighting Squadron 15, a new unit forming around the F6F-3. He trained his pilots hard, emphasizing gunnery and tactical discipline. February 1944, promotion to commander and assignment as CAG, Commander Air Group 15, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, the entire air wing aboard USS Essex, the lead ship of the Navy's new fast carrier class. Essex joined Task Force 58 in March 1944. McCampbell finally entered combat on May 19th, leading a fighter sweep over Marcus Island. His Hellcat took heavy anti-aircraft fire, bullets, shredded hydraulics. He couldn't lower his landing gear normally, had to crank it down by emergency procedure. He trapped aboard Essex with a damaged aircraft, but no kills. 3 weeks later, June 11th, flying combat air patrol over Saipan, a lone Zero emerged from clouds at 12,000 feet. McCampbell turned into it close to 300 yards, fired 3 bursts. The Zero streamed smoke and tumbled toward the ocean. First kill. He felt nothing except confirmation. He'd known he could shoot it down. The mechanics were simple: lead the target properly, squeeze the trigger, maintain the aim point through recoil. His dive, sweeps, and bombing records from the Naval Academy had trained him to stay calm under pressure, focus on execution, ignore everything else. 8 days later, June 19th, 1944, the first battle of the Philippine Sea, what pilots would remember as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese fleet launched 4 massive raids against Task Force 58, over 450 aircraft, everything the Imperial Japanese Navy could commit, from carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. They flew into a meat grinder. American radar detected them 70 miles out. F6F Hellcats stacked up from 10,000 to 25,000 feet. The Hellcat's superiority wasn't subtle. It was absolute. Commander McCampbell led a division of Hellcats into the second raid. 53 Yokosuka D4Y Judy dive bombers escorted by A6M Zeros. The formation was tight, professional, exactly what Japanese tactical doctrine prescribed. McCampbell selected the Judy on the left flank, approximately halfway back in the formation. He intended to make a single pass, pull below the formation, then attack from the opposite side. His plans changed when the first Judy exploded practically in his face. The fireball forced him to pull up above the formation instead of below it. No matter, there were targets everywhere. He destroyed 5 more Judys in the next minutes. Then, in a second sortie that afternoon, 2 zeros over Guam, 7 kills in one day, ace in a day. First time he'd achieved that status. The Marianas engagement demonstrated what Air Group 15 could accomplish. By the end of that single day, Task Force 58's fighter pilots claimed 380 kills, 368 by F6F Hellcats alone. The Japanese attack force was virtually annihilated. Only a handful of aircraft returned to their carriers. The Hellcat proved it wasn't just superior to the Zero, it was dominant. But individual ace achievements meant less than the tactical reality. American carrier air power had shifted from defensive survival to offensive dominance. The Wildcat had held the line. The Hellcat was winning the war. By October 1944, Air Group 15 had been in continuous combat for 6 months. Marcus Island, Wake Island, the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Formosa, Okinawa, more than 20,000 hours of air combat operations. The group had destroyed 315 enemy aircraft in the air and 348 on the ground. They'd sunk 296,500 tons of enemy shipping, 1 battleship, 3 aircraft carriers, 9 cruisers, 19 destroyers. Commander McCampbell personally accounted for 19 aerial victories by late September. He was Essex's Air Group commander, responsible for coordinating all strike operations, managing pilot rotations, reviewing tactical intelligence. The administrative burden was crushing. Most CAGs stopped flying combat after they assumed command, too valuable to risk in daily engagements. McCampbell ignored that guidance. He flew every major strike. His pilots needed to see their commander in the formation, not directing from a ready room. October the 24th, 1944, Essex was operating east of Luzon as part of Task Force 38.3. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had begun. American forces were invading the Philippines, and the Japanese Navy was committing everything it had left to stop them. Admiral Kurita's battleship force was pushing through the Sibuyan Sea towards San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Nishimura's southern force was approaching through Surigao Strait, and Japanese land-based air forces, the remnants of once powerful carrier air groups now flying from Philippine airfields, were launching everything flyable against the American carriers. Essex's radar detected them at 0830 an hours. Large formation, multiple groups, bearing inbound from the west, all available fighter pilots, man your planes. The squawk box blared across the ready room. McCampbell had been forbidden to fly that morning. Admiral Frederick Sherman himself had ordered him to stay aboard. Too valuable, too prominent. His public role as the Navy's leading ace made him a symbol. Symbols don't lead from behind. McCampbell decided he was indeed available and headed for Minsi III, his F6F-5 Hellcat, marked with 21 small Japanese flags below the canopy, 1 for each confirmed kill. The plane captain was still refueling when McCampbell arrived. Gauge showed half full, maybe 150 gallons in the main tank. That meant 90 minutes maximum, probably less. No time to top off. The inbound raid was closing fast. He signaled the plane captain to pull chocks. The Pratt and Whitney roared to life. Ensign Roy Rushing manned up in the Hellcat. Beside him, 5 more fighters from VF-15 joined the launch, 7 total. Not enough, but it would have to be. Essex's flight deck catapult hurled McCampbell into the Philippine morning. He climbed hard, gaining altitude. Rushing stayed on his wing, tucked in tight. The other 5 fighters followed. Radar gave them vectors, bogies at Angels 20, 40 miles west, closing. McCampbell leveled at 25,000 feet and saw them, 60 aircraft in layered formations. His radio crackled. The bomber element was below, separated from the fighter escort. Standard Japanese doctrine: fighters high to intercept enemy cap, bombers low to penetrate and deliver ordnance. McCampbell made his decision in seconds. He directed his 5 pilots to dive on the bombers. That was the primary threat. The ships couldn't defend. against mass dive bombers if they broke through the cap. But the 60 fighters would slaughter his outnumbered pilots if McCampbell didn't prevent them from diving down to support the bombers. 1 F6F against 60. Doctrine said it was suicide. But David McCampbell hadn't spent a year at a desk in Florida to die following doctrine. He keyed his microphone. "Rushing, we're taking the fighters. Stay on my wing." What happened in the next 90 minutes would either validate everything the Hellcat's designers had promised or prove that numbers still mattered more than technology. The mathematics were undeniable. 60 Japanese fighters versus 2 American Hellcats, 30-to-1 odds. Every tactical manual, every training bulletin, every after-action report from 3 years of Pacific combat emphasized the same principle. Avoid engagement when outnumbered beyond 5-to-1. Preserve the aircraft, preserve the pilot, wait for reinforcements. But the tactical manuals hadn't accounted for altitude advantage. McCampbell and Rushing held 25,000 feet. The Japanese formation was stacked between 18 and 23,000. Every 1,000 feet of altitude translated to potential energy, stored speed, the ability to dictate engagement terms. The manuals hadn't accounted for the Hellcat's speed advantage either, at 376 miles per hour maximum versus the Zero's 331. 45 miles per hour might not sound decisive, but in combat, it meant the difference between catching an enemy and watching him escape. Most critically, the manuals were written by men who'd never flown the F6F-5 against the degraded quality of late 1944 Japanese naval aviation. The pilots in those 60 fighters weren't the veterans who'd bombed Pearl Harbor or fought over the Coral Sea. Those men were dead, killed at Midway. The Solomons, the Marianas, the Japanese Navy's pilot training pipeline couldn't replace experience. Their new aviators received minimal flight hours before assignment to combat units. Some had less than 100 hours total time. They flew well in formation. Their discipline looked professional from a distance. But McCampbell had fought enough Japanese pilots to recognize the difference between competence and lethality. He scanned the formation, looking for the telltale signs. Spacing too rigid, no combat weave, no cross-cover. They were flying a parade formation toward combat, bunched tight enough that a single attacker could engage multiple targets without maneuvering. The Japanese fighter doctrine that had dominated early war engagements emphasized individual dogfighting skill and aircraft maneuverability. The Zero's legendary turn radius, its ability to outmaneuver any Allied fighter in a slow-speed scissors, had made it feared across the Pacific. But that doctrine assumed combat occurred within the Zero's performance envelope. It assumed enemy fighters would accept turning engagements where the Zero's strengths dominated. The Hellcat changed that assumption. Grumman's engineers had designed the F6F specifically to counter the Zero, incorporating lessons from captured aircraft and combat debriefs. The result wasn't a better dogfighter. It was a fighter that refused to dogfight. The Hellcat didn't try to outturn the Zero. It used boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude at high speed, firing in the brief moment of target acquisition, then extending away before the Zero could respond. The Japanese couldn't force a turning fight if the Hellcat never stayed slow enough to turn. This was the doctrine McCampbell had drilled into VF-15 for 8 months. Energy management, altitude discipline. Never ever get slow in a fight. The Hellcat's 650s delivered overwhelming firepower in the 2-second window when the target was in the gun sight. 2 seconds. Approximately 240 rounds combined output from all 6 guns. The Zero's lightweight construction couldn't survive that punishment. Most kills happened in a single pass. McCampbell glanced at Rushing. The young ensign held position perfectly, 300 yards abreast, altitude matched. They'd briefed the tactic 100 times. McCampbell would take the lead, selecting targets and calling the engagement. Rushing would cover, watching for threats converging on McCampbell from angles he couldn't see. When McCampbell pulled out of an attack run, Rushing would be there, preventing Japanese fighters from tracking through the pullout, standard 2-plane division tactics. but they'd never executed it against 30-to-1 odds. The Japanese formation continued east, still unaware of the two Hellcats above them. McCampbell checked his fuel again. 140 gallons. The gauge wasn't trustworthy under G-loads, but rough math said 70 minutes remaining, maybe 80 if he kept the throttle below military power, except during attack runs. He armed his guns. The 6 A&M-2 Brownings were already charged, 1 round in each chamber, 400 rounds per gun in the ammunition boxes, 2,400 rounds total. At the Browning's cyclic rate of 800 rounds per minute per gun, that represented exactly 30 seconds of continuous fire. But nobody fired continuously. Heat buildup would warp the barrels. Accuracy degraded after 3-second bursts. Effective technique meant short, precise bursts. 1 second, maybe 2. Enough to get rounds on target, not enough to waste ammunition. 2,400 rounds divided by 240 rounds per 2-second burst equaled 10 engagement opportunities. If every burst killed an aircraft, McCampbell could destroy 10 of the 60. Rushing would account for perhaps 6 or 7 more with perfect efficiency. That still left 43 enemy fighters, unless the mathematics weren't linear. Unless destroying the lead elements disrupted formation cohesion. Unless the psychological impact of aggressive attack from superior altitude caused the enemy formation to break apart. McCampbell had seen it happen during the Marianas Turkey shoot. Japanese formations that looked professional and disciplined from a distance collapsed into chaos when American fighters punched through them. Pilots scattered, seeking individual safety instead of maintaining mutual support. Once a formation broke apart, it became a collection of individual aircraft, each vulnerable, each focused on survival rather than mission accomplishment. The question was whether McCampbell and Rushing could generate enough violence fast enough to trigger that psychological break. They had perhaps 90 seconds before the Japanese fighters realized they were under attack and began defensive maneuvering. 90 seconds to kill as many as possible and disrupt the formation's structural integrity. McCampbell nosed the Hellcat over. 5-degree dive angle, building speed, Rushing followed. The airspeed indicator climbed. 220 knots, 240, 260. The formation grew larger in his windscreen. He selected his first target, a 0 flying slot position in the second element. Textbook target. Predictable flight path, no jinking. Pilot focused forward on formation keeping, not checking 6 o'clock. McCampbell adjusted his dive angle slightly, leading the target. The Hellcat's gun sight was a simple ring and bead arrangement, not the sophisticated computing sights the Army's fighters used. Everything depended on pilot judgment. Estimate target speed, estimate closure rate, place the bead ahead of the target by the correct deflection angle, squeeze the trigger. Maintain aim point through recoil. Range 800 yards. The 0 filled perhaps 1/3 of the gun sight ring. Still too far. 50 caliber rounds lost energy rapidly beyond 600 yards. He wanted 300, maybe 400. Close enough that missing was almost impossible. 600 yards. The 0's engine cowling was visible through the gun sight. The distinctive shape of the Nakajima sake. Radial. He could see the fighter's tail surfaces, the red circles on the wings. 500 yards. His right thumb settled on the firing button. 400 yards. Now. The Hellcat shuddered as all 6 Brownings opened fire. The noise was overwhelming, even through the engine roar. The recoil pushed against the aircraft's forward momentum, requiring slight forward stick pressure to maintain the aim point. Tracers, every 5th round, marked the bullet stream. He watched them converge on the 0's fuselage. Impacts sparkled along the wing route. The 0's canopy shattered. Smoke erupted from the engine cowling. The fighter rolled inverted and fell away, already burning. First kill. Elapsed time, 1.3 seconds of trigger time. Approximately 160 rounds expended. McCampbell released the trigger and pulled back on the stick. 3 Gs, loading the wings, converting the dive speed into a climbing left turn. The Hellcat responded instantly. He scanned for Rushing. There, pulling out of his own attack run, a second 0 was spinning down, trailing fire. 2 down, 58 remaining. The Japanese formation hadn't reacted yet. The kills had happened too fast. They were still flying east, still maintaining formation discipline. McCampbell rolled wings level at 26,000 feet, 3,000 above the enemy. He'd traded altitude for speed in the dive. Now he traded speed back for altitude in the zoom climb. Energy management. The Hellcat's engine. Water injection engaged. Delivered full military power without overheating. The Zero couldn't match that. Japanese fighters had to manage their engines carefully, avoiding extended high-power operations that could damage the lightweight radials. He selected his second target, another Zero, this one in the lead element. Eliminate the leaders, disrupt the formation structure. He nosed over again. Rushing called over the radio. 3 o'clock high, bandits turning. Some of the Japanese fighters had finally noticed the attack. 4 Zeros were breaking right, climbing to engage. McCampbell ignored them. Rushing's job was to keep those fighters off McCampbell's tail during the attack run. He focused on the lead Zero, now growing in his windscreen. This pilot was better. As McCampbell closed to 500 yards, the Zero broke hard left, a defensive turn that would have worked against a Wildcat or any Allied fighter that tried to follow. But McCampbell didn't follow the turn. He adjusted his lead, fired a 3-second burst through the space the Zero was entering, and watched the fighter fly directly into his bullet stream. The Zero's right wing shredded, the aircraft snap-rolled and went down. 3. Rushing's voice crackled through the radio. Splashed 1. 4. Total between them. Elapsed time. Approximately 2 minutes since initial engagement. The Japanese formation was reacting now. Discipline disintegrated. Fighters broke in all directions, some climbing, some diving, some attempting to reverse course back toward the bombers. The tight parade formation became a scattered mass of individual aircraft, each pilot making independent decisions. Perfect. McCampbell and Rushing worked methodically. Select a target, dive from altitude, fire, zoom, climb, reposition, select the next target. The Hellcat's speed and power meant they could dictate every engagement. They decided when to attack, which targets to engage, when to disengage. The Japanese fighters couldn't force them into turning combat. Every attempt to reverse and engage the Hellcats failed because McCampbell and Rushing simply extended away, climbing back to altitude before the Zeros could close range. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The pattern repeated. A Zero, attempting to climb after McCampbell, found itself in Rushing's gun sight instead. McCampbell destroyed another fighter, diving on Rushing, the bullet stream catching the Zero's fuselage and igniting its unprotected fuel tank. 5, 6, 7. The ammunition counters clicked downward. McCampbell's trigger discipline was perfect. 1-second bursts, 2-second bursts maximum. Never longer, never wasting rounds on targets already mortally hit. A group of 3 Zeros attempted coordinated tactics, setting up a bracket that would force McCampbell into a crossfire regardless of which way he turned. He recognized the maneuver, saw it developing, and reversed before they could complete the setup. The Hellcat's roll rate at high speed exceeded the Zeros by a significant margin. He rolled, inverted, pulled through, and fired at the trailing Zero in the bracket. The fighter exploded. 8. Rushing called out another kill. Their combined total was approaching double digits. The Japanese formation was completely broken now. Individual fighters were fleeing west, heading back toward Philippine airfields. Some continued east toward the American carriers, but without coordination. Without the numerical advantage they'd possessed 15 minutes earlier. McCampbell's fuel gauge showed 90 gallons, maybe 40 minutes remaining. His ammunition counters, gun 1, 150 rounds, gun 2, 180 rounds, guns 3 through 6, averaged 160 rounds each, approximately 1,000 rounds total remaining, enough for 5, maybe 6 more engagements. He spotted a Zero attempting to rejoin with 2 others, forming up for what looked like another coordinated attack. McCampbell climbed to 28,000 feet, positioning above and behind them. The Zero pilots were focused on each other, closing formation spacing, not maintaining defensive scan. He dove again. This time, he fired at the lead Zero from 600 yards, walked the aim point through the wingman as the first fighter burst into flames and caught the third Zero as it broke away, all 3 burning. 9, 10, 11 kills total between McCampbell and Rushing. The engagement had lasted approximately 30 minutes. The Japanese formation that had threatened Task Force 38.3 was scattered across 50 miles of Philippine Sea. Burning aircraft dotted the ocean below. Survivors were fleeing. The bomber formation McCampbell's 5 VF-15 pilots had attacked was equally disrupted. Without fighter escort, without cohesion, the Japanese strike had failed. But McCampbell's fuel was critical. 70 gallons. 30 minutes maximum, probably 25, given the combat maneuvering. Essex was 80 miles east. He called Rushing. Winchester on ammunition, bingo fuel. Time to head home. Rushing's response was immediate. Roger, lead. I'm nearly dry too. They turned east, climbing to 20,000 feet for fuel efficiency. Behind them, the last Japanese fighters disappeared toward the western horizon. The raid was broken. The carriers were safe. But the mission wasn't complete until McCampbell and Rushing landed aboard. And that, as McCampbell was about to discover, would present problems Doctrine hadn't anticipated. The fuel gauge read 60 gallons. McCampbell did the mathematics automatically. Consumption rate at cruise power, approximately 45 gallons per hour. 60 gallons meant 80 minutes, maximum. But that assumed stable cruise flight, no maneuvering, no combat power settings. He'd been pulling Gs for 30 minutes, running the engine hard, burning fuel at rates far exceeding the manual's cruise consumption figures. Realistically, he had perhaps 50 minutes of fuel remaining. Essex was 75 miles east. At cruise speed of 210 knots indicated, that meant 22 minutes flight time. Tight, but manageable, assuming nothing went wrong. Rushing's voice came through the radio, tension evident despite the professional tone. Laid my fuel's showing 50 gallons. I'm lower than you. McCampbell acknowledged. Stay in formation, we'll make it. But privately, he wasn't certain. 50 gallons for Rushing meant the Ensign had perhaps 40 minutes remaining. They needed to cover 75 miles, find the carrier, enter the landing pattern, and trap aboard. All within 40 minutes. The margins were vanishing. They climbed to 22,000 feet, leaning the mixture for maximum range. The Pratt and Whitney R2800 could run efficiently at altitude, sipping fuel when properly managed. But even efficient consumption was consumption. Every minute aloft burned another gallon. McCampbell scanned the eastern horizon. Nothing yet. Essex should be visible at 30 miles in clear conditions, but morning haze over the Philippine Sea reduced visibility to perhaps 20 miles. At 15 minutes into the return flight, McCampbell's fuel gauge showed 45 gallons. He'd burned 15 gallons, covering 50 miles. Simple extrapolation said he'd burn another 9 gallons, covering the remaining 25 miles to the carrier. That left 36 gallons for landing pattern, approach, and trap. Possible. Barely. But Rushing's situation was worse. The ensign called again. 38 gallons lead. I'm not going to make it back to the ship. McCampbell's response was immediate. Yes, you will. Stay on my wing. We'll get you aboard. The confidence in his voice was calculated. Panic killed more pilots than enemy fire. Rushing needed to believe recovery was possible, needed to focus on flying the aircraft rather than contemplating ditching in the Philippine Sea. 20 miles out, McCampbell spotted the wake patterns. Task Force 38.3, 4 carriers in formation, destroyers and cruisers screening the perimeter. Essex was the lead ship, her wake, a white line cutting through blue water. He called the ship Essex, say, 2 Hellcats inbound, state bingo fuel. Request immediate recovery. The response should have been in immediate clearance. Instead, the radio remained silent for 10 seconds. Then, CAG, Essex. Flight deck is fouled. Launching strike against Kurita's battle force. Estimate 20 minutes until deck is clear. 20 minutes. McCampbell glanced at his fuel gauge. 32 gallons. Rushing had maybe 25. They didn't have 20 minutes. He keyed the microphone again. Essex, gauge. We are emergency fuel. Cannot hold 20 minutes. Another pause. Then a different voice. Senior, authoritative. Chechi, this is Air Boss. Understand your fuel state. Langley has clear deck. Vector 095, 12 miles. They're ready to recover you, USS Langley, CVL-27. One of the Independence-class light carriers. Smaller than Essex, but equally capable of recovering F6Fs. McCampbell turned to the new heading. 12 miles at 200 knots meant 3.5 minutes. Fuel burn, approximately 2.5 gallons. He'd arrive over Langley with 29 gallons, maybe 30. Rushing would have, perhaps, 22. The light carrier appeared ahead, wake turning into the wind for recovery operations. McCampbell began his descent, configuring for landing. Gear down. 3 green lights confirmed extension. Flaps to landing position. Tail hook down. Reduce power to approach speed 105 knots over the ramp. He called the ball, Hellcat Ball 3.0. The landing signal officer responded immediately. Roger Ball. Paddles came up, guiding him down the glide slope. McCampbell flew the approach automatically. 327 carrier landings had made the process mechanical. Hold the meatball centered. Adjust power for glide slope. Don't chase the lineup. Smooth corrections. The Hellcat crossed Langley's ramp at 105 knots. The tail hook caught the number 3 wire. 7 Gs of deceleration slammed McCampbell forward against his shoulder harness. The Hellcat stopped in 120 feet. He raised the hook, added power to taxi forward. The engine coughed, sputtered, died. The fuel was gone. The propeller windmilled to a stop. Deck crew rushed forward, pushing the Hellcat manually out of the landing area. Rushing trapped 15 seconds later, his landing equally precise. When the deck crew checked his fuel tanks, they found less than 5 gallons remaining. Both aircraft had landed with minutes of fuel remaining, possibly less. McCampbell climbed out of the cockpit. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the altitude cold. Deck crew were already examining Minsi III. They counted bullet holes, 14. Most were small caliber, 7.7 millimeter from 0 cow guns. 3 were larger, 20 millimeter cannon rounds that had punched through non-critical areas without hitting fuel tanks, hydraulics, or flight controls. The Hellcat's armor had absorbed punishment. That would have destroyed a 0. Langley's air intelligence officer met McCampbell in the ready room. Commander, we need a preliminary debrief before you return to Essex. How many enemy aircraft did you engage? McCampbell thought for a moment. Approximately 60 fighters, mixed Zeros and Oscars. The AIO's expression didn't change, but his tone sharpened. 60 fighters, you and Ensign Rushing, 2 aircraft, correct. And you're both here. Both aircraft recovered. Correct. How many kills are you claiming? McCampbell had learned not to overestimate. Early war combat reports were filled with inflated claims, multiple pilots shooting the same aircraft, and each claiming a kill. He had been rigorous about confirmation. I personally observed 9 aircraft destroyed. Ensign Rushing can confirm 6 more. The AIO wrote the numbers. 9 confirmed for you, 6 for Rushing, 15 total, against 60 bandits, and the skepticism was obvious. Commander, that's an extraordinary claim. We'll need to review gun camera footage. McCampbell nodded. The F6F-5 mounted a gun camera synchronized to the trigger. Every time he'd fired, the camera had recorded the engagement. The footage would either confirm or refute his claims. We'll provide all camera footage for analysis. But I'm confident in the count. The AIO made more notes, then looked up. The bomber formation you directed your other 5 pilots against. They report destroying or scattering approximately 18 aircraft. Combined with your 15, that's 33 enemy aircraft destroyed or disabled from a formation that radar estimated at 60 to 80 total. The strike never reached our carriers. Not a single bomb fell on Task Force 38.3. That was the number that mattered. Not individual kill counts, not records, not personal achievement. The carriers were safe. The mission was successful. Everything else was accounting. A destroyer transported McCampbell and Rushing back to Essex 2 hours later. When McCampbell climbed through the Harrier's hatch, he found the air group already analyzing the engagement. Gun camera footage was being developed Pilot debriefs were being compiled. Intelligence officers were correlating radar tracks with visual reports, attempting to reconstruct the engagement timeline. Commander James Flatley, one of the Navy's most experienced fighter tacticians and a veteran of Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, was aboard Essex as an observer. He cornered McCampbell in the ready room. "Dave, I've been reviewing the preliminary reports. You and Rushing engaged a formation of 60-plus aircraft, alone, for 90 minutes. That's not tactics, that's suicide." McCampbell poured coffee, said nothing. Flatley continued, "Except you're here. They're not. So either you got extraordinarily lucky or you did something that's going to rewrite fighter doctrine for the rest of this war." "Which is it?" McCampbell sat, organizing his thoughts. "The Hellcat gives us advantages previous fighters didn't have. Speed, power, firepower. The Japanese are still flying tactics developed for the Zero's strengths, tight formations, mutual support at low speed, dogfighting. Those tactics don't work against an aircraft that refuses to dogfight." Flatley nodded. "Boom and zoom. We've been teaching that since Midway." "Yes, but we've been teaching it defensively. Use speed to escape when outnumbered. I used it offensively. Speed to attack, altitude to dictate engagement terms, power to disengage before they could respond. We never stayed in their envelope long enough for their numbers to matter." Flatley was silent for a moment. "Then, how many times did they get guns on you?" "Twice. Both times I extended before they could track through the shot. The Hellcat's speed advantage meant they couldn't pursue effectively. They'd maneuver to engage, but by the time they completed the turn, we were already out of range, climbing back to altitude." "And the fuel situation?" McCampbell grimaced. "That was closer than I'd prefer. We launched with half tanks because there wasn't time to refuel. 90 minutes of combat and half fuel is pushing the envelope. We trapped with fumes. You landed on Langley. Essex's deck was fouled. We didn't have time to wait." McCampbell paused, then added, "The fuel issue raises a broader question. If we'd had full tanks, we could have stayed engaged longer, destroyed more of that formation. But the urgency to launch meant we went with what we had. There's a tension between getting fighters airborne quickly and ensuring they have the fuel to complete the mission." Flatley made notes. "This is going into the tactical bulletin. Everything you did today, the altitude advantage, the hit-and-run tactics, the energy management. But we're also going to address the fuel situation. Carriers need procedures for emergency launches that still ensure fighters have minimum fuel for extended combat." The gun camera footage came back the following day, grainy black and white film, synchronized to McCampbell's trigger pulls. The intelligence officers reviewed every frame. 9 confirmed kills for McCampbell. The footage showed clear destruction, aircraft exploding, wings separating, fires erupting, no ambiguity. Rushing's claims were equally verified. 6 confirmed, 15 enemy aircraft destroyed by 2 fighters in a single engagement. It was unprecedented. The previous record for a single mission was 7 kills, achieved by Lieutenant Alexander Vrachu during the Marianas Turkey shoot. McCampbell had destroyed 9. The combined total of 15 exceeded any two-plane element's accomplishment in naval aviation history. But the raw numbers didn't capture the tactical significance. McCampbell and Rushing had engaged a formation 30 times larger than their own element, and not merely survived, but dominated. They'd broken up a strike that threatened 4 carriers and 12,000 sailors. They'd demonstrated that the Hellcat, properly employed, could achieve results that previous doctrine had considered impossible. Admiral Frederick Sherman, commander of Task Group 38.3, reviewed the engagement reports personally. On October the 27th, 3 days after the mission, he forwarded a recommendation through channels. Commander David McCampbell's actions on October the 24th, 1944, reflected extraordinary valor and tactical brilliance. His aggressive interception of a numerically superior enemy force, resulting in 9 confirmed kills and complete disruption of the enemy strike, prevented significant damage to this task group's carriers. I recommend Commander McCampbell for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation moved through 5th Fleet headquarters, then to Pacific Fleet, then to Washington. The Medal of Honor required verification beyond normal combat reports. The Navy investigated thoroughly. Radar tracks were analyzed, pilot statements were cross-referenced, gun camera footage was reviewed frame by frame. Japanese radio intercepts from October the 24th were examined for references to aircraft losses. The investigation confirmed everything. 60-plus Japanese aircraft had been detected by radar. 15 were confirmed, destroyed by McCampbell and Rushing. The strike had failed to reach the American carriers. No bombs had fallen on Task Force 38.3 that morning. But the investigation also raised questions about doctrine. Multiple senior officers noted the same concern Commander Flatley had expressed. Engaging 60 aircraft with 2 fighters violated every principle of numerical superiority that had governed fighter tactics since the First World War. The fact that it succeeded didn't make it recommended doctrine. It made it an exceptional case, driven by exceptional circumstances and exceptional pilots. Captain Arleigh Burke, one of the Navy's most aggressive destroyer commanders and a future chief of naval operations, wrote in a classified memo, "McCampbell's success demonstrates the Hellcat's capabilities, but should not be interpreted as license for pilots to engage in similar situations. 2 fighters against 60 works when those 2 fighters are flown by men of McCampbell's caliber. For average pilots, it remains suicide. We must distinguish between what's possible and what's advisable." The tension was real. The Navy needed aggressive fighter pilots willing to engage against odds, but it also needed those pilots to survive long enough to matter. The balance between aggression and survival, between pressing advantages and preserving forces, had no perfect answer. McCampbell's mission succeeded because he understood his aircraft's capabilities intimately, because he maintained perfect tactical discipline under pressure, because his ammunition management and energy tactics were flawless. Most pilots couldn't replicate that performance, but the Navy could teach the principles. Altitude advantage, speed management, boom and zoom tactics, ammunition conservation, those were teachable skills. The Hellcat made them possible. Proper training made them effective. By November 1944, Air Group 15 rotated back to the United States. 6 months of continuous combat had exhausted the pilots and ground crew. Essex returned to Pearl Harbor, then to the West Coast for refit. McCampbell's final tally, 34 confirmed aerial victories, 21 aircraft destroyed on the ground. The Navy's leading ace, the 3rd highest scoring American ace of World War II, behind only Army Air Force majors Richard Bong with 40 kills and Thomas Maguire with 38. But McCampbell survived. Bong and Maguire both died in aircraft accidents before the war ended. McCampbell, the 3rd highest scoring ace, became the highest scoring American ace to survive the war. On January 10th, 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt presented the Medal of Honor at a White House ceremony. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty as Commander, Air Group 15, during combat against enemy Japanese aerial forces in the first and second battles of the Philippine Sea." An inspiring leader, fighting boldly in the face of terrific odds, Commander McCampbell led his fighter planes against a force of 80 Japanese carrier-based aircraft bearing down on our fleet on June 19, 1944. Striking fiercely in valiant defense of our surface force, he personally destroyed 7 hostile planes during this single engagement, in which the outnumbering attack force was utterly routed and virtually annihilated. During a major fleet engagement with the enemy on October the 24th, Commander McCampbell, assisted by but 1 plane, intercepted and daringly attacked a formation of 60 hostile land-based craft approaching our forces. Fighting desperately but with superb skill against such overwhelming air power, he shot down 9 Japanese planes and, completely disorganizing the enemy group, forced the remainder to abandon the attack before a single aircraft could reach the fleet. The citation covered both the Marianas Turkey Shoot and the Leyte Gulf engagement. 7 kills in June, 9 in October, 16 enemy aircraft destroyed in 2 days of combat, both times against overwhelming numerical odds. The Medal of Honor recognized not just the kills, but the tactical impact. McCampbell hadn't simply shot down aircraft. He'd prevented those aircraft from reaching American carriers, from killing American sailors, from disrupting American offensive operations. Ensign Roy Rushing received the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration, for his 6 kills on October the 24th. The citation noted his extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in supporting Commander McCampbell's attack against superior forces. Rushing would survive the war, leave active service in 1946, and die in 1986. His contribution to the October 24th engagement was often overshadowed by McCampbell's record-setting performance. But professional aviators understood that Rushing's discipline and tactical execution were equally critical to the mission's success. Air Group 15's final combat statistics validated everything McCampbell had built: 315 aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 348 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 296,500 tons of enemy shipping sunk, 1 battleship, 3 aircraft carriers, 9 cruisers, 19 destroyers. The group flew more than 20,000 hours of combat operations. Over 6 months, it established records that would stand for the remainder of the war. The F6F Hellcat's combat record told a broader story. From its combat debut in September 1943 through the war's end in August 1945. The Hellcat accounted for 5,156 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 75% of all U.S. Navy aerial victories in the Pacific theater, the kill-to-loss ratio, 19-1. 19 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost in combat. No other American fighter in any theater approached that effectiveness. The P-51 Mustang, legendary in the European theater, achieved approximately 2-to-1 kill ratios against the Luftwaffe. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the Marine Corps' F-4U Corsair, excellent aircraft all, posted single-digit kill ratios. The Hellcat's 19-to-1 ratio wasn't just superior, it was dominant. Part of that dominance came from the aircraft's design. Grumman had built a fighter specifically to counter the Zero's strengths while exploiting its weaknesses. The R-2800 engine delivered reliable power. The 6 50-caliber guns delivered devastating firepower. The armor protected pilots. The self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. Everything about the F6F was optimized for carrier operations and Pacific combat. But design alone didn't account for 19-to-1 ratios. Pilot training, tactical doctrine, and maintenance all contributed. By late 1944, American carrier pilots were receiving more flight hours before combat deployment than Japanese pilots received in their entire training pipeline. The doctrine emphasized energy tactics over dogfighting, altitude advantage over turning combat, teamwork over individual heroism, and the maintenance. Grumman had designed the Hellcat for ease of service. Engine changes that took days on other fighters took hours on the F6F. Battle damage that would ground other aircraft could be repaired aboard ship by carrier maintenance crews. The Hellcat's operational availability rates exceeded 90%, meaning 9 out of 10 aircraft were flyable at any given time. For comparison, the Zero's operational availability by late 1944 was below 60%. All of these factors combined to create the weapon system that won air superiority in the Pacific. The Hellcat wasn't just a fighter. It was the embodiment of American industrial capacity, pilot training quality, and tactical innovation. McCampbell's October 24th mission demonstrated what happened when all those factors aligned in a single engagement. After the war, McCampbell continued serving. He commanded the attack carrier USS Bonhomme Richard. He served on the Joint Chiefs of Staff as Plans Division Chief. He retired in 1964 with 31 years of service, having never been shot down by enemy action in over 300 combat missions. In retirement, he rarely discussed his combat record. When pressed by interviewers, he deflected attention to his aircraft and his squadron mates. The Hellcat was an outstanding fighter plane, he told the U.S. Naval Institute in a 1987 oral history interview. It performed well, was easy to fly, and brought most of us home. I can't say enough good things about the Grumman Hellcat, F6F. Regarding the October 24th engagement specifically, McCampbell's assessment was characteristically understated. To this day, I think those must have been replacement pilots with minimal training because they gave us very little fight. 2 or 3 tried to climb to higher altitude. Of course, we picked them off in a hurry. The rest of the time, they were just flying right along, and we were knocking them off right and left. Since they were headed back to Manila and away from our task group, we were in a position to strike them from the rear. That quote, recorded 43 years after the engagement, revealed McCampbell's tactical awareness. He'd recognized immediately that the Japanese formation consisted of poorly trained pilots. He'd exploited their lack of defensive awareness. He'd attacked from their rear hemisphere where they were least likely to detect threats. He'd maintained altitude and speed advantages throughout, and he'd described all of it in matter-of-fact terms, as if the success was inevitable rather than extraordinary. But others recognized what McCampbell had accomplished. Barrett Tillman, the preeminent historian of American carrier aviation, wrote that McCampbell's October 24th mission represented the apex of single-mission fighter effectiveness in the Pacific War. Admiral James Holloway, former Chief of Naval Operations and himself a combat pilot, described McCampbell as the embodiment of everything the Navy needed in a fighter pilot: aggressive, skilled, disciplined, and lucky. The luck factor was real. McCampbell flew over 300 combat missions without being shot down. He encountered anti-aircraft fire that damaged his aircraft multiple times. He fought against Japanese aces who'd survived years of combat. He pushed fuel states to critical levels. He engaged numerical odds that should have killed him. Yet, he survived every engagement, landed every mission, brought every aircraft home or safely aboard another carrier when necessary. Skill explained much of that survival, but skill alone didn't explain landing with 2 rounds of ammunition remaining and fuel tanks dry. Now that was luck. Good luck, sustained luck, the kind of luck that defines the difference between aces who become legends and aces who become statistics. David McCampbell died on June 30th, 1996, at age 86. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. In 2002, the Navy commissioned USS McCampbell, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer. In his honor, the ship serves with the 7th Fleet in the Pacific, operating in the same waters where McCampbell fought in 1944. The Hellcat itself passed into history more quickly. By 1947, the Navy had retired nearly all F6Fs from frontline service, replacing them with jet fighters. The last operational Hellcats served with reserve squadrons until the early 1950s. A few survived as drones, a target aircraft for missile testing. Most were scrapped. Today, approximately 25 F6F Hellcats survive in museums and private collections. 7 remain airworthy. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola displays an F6F-5 painted in McCampbell's markings, complete with 34 Japanese flags below the canopy. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum preserves another F6F-5, this one from VF-15, but not McCampbell's personal aircraft. These preserved Hellcats serve as physical reminders of the aircraft that turned the tide in the Pacific. Visitors can see the 6 50-caliber guns in the wings, the armor plate behind the pilot's seat, the R-2800 engine that delivered 2,000 horsepower. They can imagine what McCampbell experienced. The engine's roar, the recoil when all 6 guns fired, the G-forces in a high-speed dive, the fuel gauge dropping toward empty. But imagination only goes so far. The reality of October the 24th, 1944, the actual experience of engaging 60 aircraft with a wingman and emerging victorious, belongs to a vanishingly small group of men. McCampbell and Rushing lived it. A handful of other aces approached similar situations in different engagements. The rest of us can only study the records, analyze the tactics, and attempt to understand how 2 fighters defeated 30. The answer isn't simple. It wasn't just the Hellcat's superiority, though that mattered. It wasn't just McCampbell's skill, though that was critical. It wasn't just Japanese pilot quality degradation, though that was real. It was all of those factors, combined with tactical discipline, ammunition conservation, energy management, fuel efficiency, and yes, luck. Remove any single factor, and the engagement likely ends differently. McCampbell runs out of ammunition before breaking up the formation, or he runs out of fuel before reaching Langley, or a lucky Japanese deflection shot hits something critical, or the Japanese pilots are veterans who maintain formation discipline and coordinate their defense. Any of those outcomes was possible. None occurred. Instead, McCampbell and Rushing destroyed 15 aircraft, scattered the formation, prevented the strike from reaching American carriers, and landed safely with empty tanks and nearly empty guns. It was, in every measurable way, the perfect execution of fighter doctrine. Altitude advantage, speed advantage, firepower advantage, all exploited to maximum effect. The Hellcat enabled that execution. McCampbell's skill perfected it. And on that morning in October 1944, above the Philippine Sea, 2 American pilots proved that sometimes the mathematics that say you can't win are wrong. Sometimes aggression defeats numbers. Sometimes skill overcomes odds. Sometimes the pilot and the aircraft are so perfectly matched to the mission that the impossible becomes inevitable. 60 aircraft, 2 Hellcats, 90 minutes, 15 kills, 0 American losses. The numbers speak for themselves. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.